Hello, my name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 66, with our returning guests today in sort of a panel discussion, Dorollo Nixon and Libby Unger. We're going to start today from the U.S. Constitution. Specifically, we're going to begin today with the 14th Amendment. So I'm going to read directly from the intro to the U.S. Constitution, and I'm going to jump right into the 14th Amendment. And I quote, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." Amendment 14, Section 1. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. Neither deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Section 2. Representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. But when the right to vote at any election for the choice of electors for president and vice president of the United States, representatives in Congress, the executive and judicial officers of a state, or the members of the legislature thereof, is denied to any of the male inhabitants of such state, being 21 years of age and citizens of the United States, or in any way abridged, except for participation in rebellion or other crime, the basis of representation therein shall be reduced in proportion which the number of such male citizens shall bear to the whole number of male citizens 21 years of age in such state. Section 3. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state, to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. Section 4. The validity of the public debt of the United States, authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned. But neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or any claim for the loss or emancipation of any slave. But all such debts, obligations, and claims shall be held illegal and void. Section 5. The Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. Never, ever, 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 ever bet against America. This is one of the topic areas that we explored last year on the podcast when Dorollo came on and we talked about the U.S. Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and of course the Anti-Federalist Papers. And I said this last year and it bears repeating because some of y'all done forgot. The U.S. Constitution is the oldest written and codified national constitution in force in the West. 236 years, I believe, and it is primarily a charter of negative rights, even the 14th Amendment, especially the 14th Amendment. In the parlance of our time, our era, the Constitution defines the relationship between the people and the state and lays out in a practical, easy way to understand what the duties of government actually are. It also acts as a companion document to the Declaration of Independence, again, a reminder for many of you, in that it aligns the mission of the United States with the vision provided so clearly by the Declaration itself. Now, in light of what I fundamentally believe is the turn of the tide in American postmodern culture. We are going to talk about the 14th Amendment. We are going to talk about the U.S. Constitution. We're even going to touch on the Federalist Papers with my two guests today. Both friends of the show, both have come on the show and have talked about various aspects of economics and politics and law and how those aspects can impact leaders and leadership and what leaders should think about those areas. And we're going to kind of throw all of their intellectual heft, including some of my own, behind this topic today, behind this topic that is very important for leaders, because there's some integral lessons that we need to apply that I think will benefit us both now and in the future by staring at these documents, by talking about the Supreme Court, and by figuring out what we can actually do with all this information. So I'd like to invite back two friends to the podcast. I'd like to thank two friends of the podcast for showing up today, Dorollo Nixon and Libby Unger. Welcome to the podcast, Dorollo and Libby. And for our first question, I'm going to throw it out there. Actually, I'm going to throw it out there to Libby. I'm going to let Libby jump off on this one. The U.S. Constitution, particularly specifically the 14th Amendment, talks directly about equal protection. And I want you to sort of describe for us, in your reading of the amendment, your reading of the sections in the Federalist Papers, and of course the most recent Supreme Court decisions, what exactly does equal protection mean in as diverse a country as the United States?
Thank you, Hassan. It's good to meet you, Dorollo, officially. I was intrigued by what Dorollo's response was, given that you guys did this last year, or covered this topic last year. But I'm happy to start. For me, it's about limiting the amount of freedom that we're, as God-given citizens and human beings, that it is the government's job to not restrict our liberties and to protect all, regardless of sex and race, and age and economics and all that kind of fun stuff, to allow and enable everyone equal access to opportunities, regardless of those immutable characteristics, as well as other characteristics that could come into play. But for me, we should all it's about being colorblind, sex blind. And I know sex wasn't part of the 14th, but you can but we have evolved towards that. And to me, it really is about equal access to opportunity to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. Also means that that the laws apply equally to all. So as long as you're abiding by the rules of law, you have equal opportunity and access to all of those ways to find happiness and liberty on your terms. That being said, due process is incredibly important element of all of this, and that if we restrict protections, it is only because due process has been applied in a colorblind fashion. I'll stop there. But for me, it really is about equal opportunity to become your best self on your terms within the constraints of the laws that are colorblind.
Now, Dorollo, there's a lot there that Libby just said. And so how do you think about equal protection? Again, from the perspective of a lawyer who's actually looking at this potentially through a legal lens, but also through the perspective of a historian. How do you how do you react or respond to what Libby has just laid out there?
Hi, Son. Great to be back. Great to meet you, Libby. As I said earlier, I looked you up on LinkedIn. Great profile. You've done some amazing things. I think that's wonderful. So, in response to both your question, Hassan, and Libby's statement, first of all, you're correct. As a lawyer, and certainly a lawyer who litigates in federal court and thus has to handle constitutional issues from time to time, you know, the lens through which I view all of this and engage with all this is that of a lawyer. So when I look at the 14th Amendment, certainly Section 1, which has the most famous parts of it, you know, the due process part and the equal protection of the laws part, what I see is that the government is being prohibited from denying people equal protection of the laws. So it's not about opportunity from this perspective, it's about protection. And so one of the ways we can show this, I think readily, is to use examples. So you show up at the lunch counter at a federal facility and you get food on your tray and you get to the head of the line and the cashier refuses to let you pay for your food or take your food. You have the money, you're being denied the right to purchase the food. This is a failure of the federal government to protect your right to purchase the food. Now, if you don't have any money, they are correct in denying you the food. Now, someone out of the goodness of his or her heart may offer you the food, or the person before or behind you in line, or that woman who's 3 people down. She may buy it for you. That's perfectly fine. The equal protection issue is when the government agent won't let you purchase the food. A different example would be your house is on fire, so you call the fire department. That is usually a state agency or a quasi-state agency. And they show up, look at you, look at your burning house, and say, we're not helping you, and they drive away. That's also denial of equal protection of the laws. And so the particular evil that the framers of this amendment were trying to address was basically the view of discrimination against Negroes that they could see coming, as it were, right? And so they were trying to frame American society such that government institutions would no longer be doing those things, okay? And of course, ironically or not, that's exactly what happened. And from 1870 until 1896, when you had the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which I know you're going to refer to, that has one of the best dissents ever written in any federal or certainly Supreme Court case, in which then Justice John Marshall Harlan talked about the type of society that America was supposed to be versus the type of society it was. And he did an excellent job, certainly better than I am right now, talking about entrenched discrimination, talking about patterns of abuse, and talking about prospects for that continuing. And what our system of government was supposed to do to prevent that is right here in this amendment. And so, yeah, if I were to refer to one other judicial opinion right now on these issues, Justice Powell's opinion in the Bakke case, which was the first successful challenge to affirmative action in that case, it's medical school admissions in California. Justice Powell's decision, which wasn't actually the court's decision, but came to stand for what the court apparently stood for, which is what we call judicial gymnastics. What I like about his opinion is how he expressed some of these issues, okay? He was able to talk about both issues. He was able to refer to issues from 1868, but to frame them in 1980, because I believe that's when a decision was made, and to talk about, to borrow a phrase used there that was quoted from somewhere else, that you cannot turn back the clock of our liberties. And so, though it got them going, they were slow to get going, eventually the Supreme Court would start saying, this protects any person, not citizen, from the law protecting one person in one setting and refusing to protect somebody else in the same setting. It's beautiful, and I think it's fitting and important for a society that claims to be free and that relies on institutions that are open to all, given both appropriate talent, motivation, and where something is required to be purchased money, that you show up and you'll be given a fair shake. You'll be allowed to do what you're intending to do or what your rights allow you to do, and the government is not going to stand in the way. Yeah, so that's basically it.
So the challenge here that I see, and it is a challenge. The challenge here that I see is the challenge of this idea of immutable characteristics. This is the biggest challenge to this, right? Because initially we have immutable characteristics of race. National origin is thought to be an immutable characteristic. It's almost read into the 14th Amendment because, and let's put some historical context around the 14th Amendment. This comes out of the Civil War. This is an attempt to circumvent, not only circumvent, but also punish the South and the Southern Confederacy for its behavior during the Civil War, right? And even behavior up to the Civil War. It's actually weirdly, well, no, not weirdly. It's an attempt to circumvent that. Okay. Based on the immutable characteristic of race, immutable meaning something you were born with that you have no control over. You don't get to choose your race. Okay. We've expanded the canon. We've become more democratic over the course of time in what is immutable. We have become, we've moved things that used to be mutable into the immutable space. And we are now in a place where we have to, I think, sort of collapse that framing back. So this question is for Libby, with me saying that. How do we do that successfully under the auspices of the 14th Amendment? And Dorollo, by the way, brought up two very interesting, and this is why I love talking with him about this. He brought up two very interesting examples there, right? You know, the lunch counter that you want, actually one very interesting example, you know, the lunch counter that you want to eat at, right? But it's a lunch counter in a federal institution. And then he talked about medical schools with medical school admission. Those are two fundamentally different spaces, right? A federal lunch counter, that's one thing. That's everybody's money. But a medical school, everybody doesn't have a right to go to Harvard Medical School. Everybody can't go to Harvard Medical School, right? Now, Harvard Medical School may take money for students from the federal government, which that's where the federal government that puts its nose in the tent there. But Libby, how do we define what's immutable in a private space versus a public space?
Thanks, Hassan and Dorollo. Thank you so much for the this great legal examples that really characterize what equal protection means versus equal opportunity. What the private space versus the public space is very interesting. And I think of the private space, everything's on a spectrum. There's government provision of services, there's private provision of services, and there's private lives. And how we live in our households, how we live when we're walking down the streets, etc. And this protection of the individual's rights, we have taking it beyond the services piece into how we should treat each other when we're just walking down the street. And that to me is where we've seen the expansion that is extremely dangerous. Where I'm not gonna discuss whether sexual proclivity or your gender fluidity, any of that's immutable or not. To me, that's not an issue. Where we're at issue now is with individuals proclaiming in your face that you must acknowledge them when you're just walking down the street. And that's not a legal obligation or right in my views. It may be a right of mutual respect, but but I actually think it's a bigger issue around a societal and cultural issues where people aren't feeling seen and validated. So they're trying to use legal rules to be seen and validated, and they're using immutable characteristics to try to stretch the meaning of or them being seen and validated. I would like us to get back into this space of service provision by private entities and public entities. It's kind of that space where the immutables may matter a bit more and are relevant. But what Dorollo spoke to for me is really an overriding principle that really matters and comes into the blindness around sexual proclivity, gender, race is more about everyone does have the opportunity to go to Harvard, right? But you have to demonstrate that you have the talent, the ambition, and the money. And that's where competition comes in. And the competition should be based on it should not be based on immutable characteristics. It should be based on your talent, ambition, and money. So we all have equal opportunity to pursue it, but we're not all equally skilled or capable of getting into Harvard. And that's why some of us go to state schools. That's why some of us go to community colleges. We also have different things that are of interest to us that we want to pursue that may not require college at all. But there's also the concept of religious freedom, which was very big in our Constitution. And where does religious beliefs, if you're providing a service to the public, like you're a McDonald's or a web designer, at what point can you say, no, I don't want to provide those services to you because they violate my religious beliefs? And that's where I think this case in Colorado is really interesting, because if we can go into more details, I'd love to hear Dorollo's perspective on this as well, is that the woman who was willing to provide creative web design services to gays, if it wasn't around doing a wedding site. But it was a violation of her free speech as well as her religious beliefs to actually produce a website for a gay couple around a wedding. But she had demonstrated that she didn't have a prejudice around your sexual orientation. She had a prejudice around her religious beliefs on marriage, specifically related to a religious she was concerned about the religious side of gay marriage. So we're getting into this, especially in a knowledge-based economy where individuals are providing services and being paid for them. Where are you required to provide services that are in violation of your religious beliefs based on someone's immutable characteristics? And when are you being compelled to act a certain way? So there's the service side of it. And then there's the true private experience where you're just walking down the street and someone thinks that because you didn't look them in the eye, that you were being, because you're maybe a single woman walking down the street and didn't look at another woman, they're going to get irate because you didn't acknowledge them, and women should acknowledge other women. Like, we have stupid stuff like that does happen. So I think we just need to get back into the service provision space, stop mandating how people should behave based on immutable characteristics that many of us can't even ascertain from just looking at someone. So I'll stop there. There was a lot in there, but I think it's a really important conversation. And Dorollo, from a legal perspective, I have no doubt has some good cases in there that will help us to define that and get us back to sanity.
Well, let's go to Dorollo on that. What are your thoughts, Dorollo, on anything that Libby has said there?
Yes, those are great comments. I appreciate them and your candor and the breadth of what you covered, Libby, because I thought that was really important. And yes, I do not doubt that there are women walking down the street who pass each other, and then one of them then has an issue because nothing was said. I'm certain that happens with Black people. I would bet money on that, actually. So it's definitely interesting. Yes, yes, it does seem to me also that we seem to have gone into the weeds, that we left the fairway, we entered the rough, we went through a little woods, and now we're in those ugly, swampy reed things. And it's like, hang on, how did we get over here? Now, one of the reasons I think we got over there, though, is because one of the hardest things to do with power is to not use it. And so one of the running definitions I have of a free society is one in which you can hold an unpopular opinion and still be safe. Related to that notion is the idea that there are just certain things that just ain't the government's business. And so there are ways and only sexual things fall in that category for me. And so it's interesting that one of my least favorite Supreme Court decisions, Roe v. Wade, is predicated upon a decision called Griswold v. Connecticut from, I believe, 1965, in which successfully the litigant was able, the appellant, I believe, but the litigant was able to challenge a state restriction on distribution of contraceptives. And what Justice William O. Douglas said in that decision that he wrote, and of course, William O. Douglas was a dinosaur and a real liberal. Not like liberals around today, says this conservative, Dorollo Nixon Jr. No, a real liberal who was out there doing whatever the hell he wanted because he was a free man. Okay, that's what he did. So when he wrote that decision, he basically said, this is not the government's business. And I agree with that idea. Of course, part of the problem he created is how he justified his decision. And then that led in the next decade to Roe, which we were stuck with until this year or last year, I think it was, whenever Roe went. Anyway, I believe it was last year, 2022. Anyway, we got into the weeds because we could, as a society, say these things over here, they may matter, but the government's not going to take a position on them. And so I believe that could include something like in a state where you have people and they say, hey, we want to get married. And we'll say, hang on a minute. Marriage, it's like a man and a woman. And they say, well, we want to try it this way. Oh, okay. I think in certain spaces, if that were to be enacted under law, okay, which I think at a minimum it would have necessitated a change to the law. But if that change to the law then went through, to me, then it would fall into a space where it's like, oh, okay, well, is this really the government's business? Okay, no. So then the government would carry on doing that. We want to form a business over here doing something else. Oh, okay. We have messages we put on license plates. Oh, okay. So what are there bounds to that? Are there certain things you're not allowed to put on a license plate? And if so, well, how do we decide which fall into the good category and which don't? I mean, we can get, not we, our government's pronouncements, decisions, and certainly where courts go can end up stuck in the weeds because the people in power just can't decide. The government's not going to take a position on that. But yeah, it's there definitely needs to be some redressing of where we're at. I think it's going to happen. I think that the affirmative action decision that basically struck it down, the use of racial preferences in higher ed, I think that there's the possibility that that will be the first domino that will basically remove a legal infrastructure that is set up to do something that arguably it shouldn't have been used to do. But all that does is return the issue to society itself. And that's where it should be in a democracy. That's where it should be in a free society. People deciding how they want to live and how we want to live together. I think it's great. One of the things that is going to be interesting, especially in the context of religious freedoms in a society that when you start to remove pre-boomers and boomers, you get to a much less religious society, and that's putting it mildly, okay? The concern I have as a religious man is, will that society understand what my rights are, understand that they're legitimate and have to be protected, or will they just run roughshod over them? The colloquial reference I'm going to use, because I did the Googling, is that around at least 50 to 55% of the U.S. population was born from 1981 until now. And so what I couldn't find is how to get that number down to circa 1992 or 93 is the beginning date. And the reason I wanted to choose that date is because one of the classical examples from African American culture, when we want to refer to somebody in his home, not a government worker, in his home, saying nonsense in quotation marks about Black people, we say Archie Bunker. We have a picture, we have something you could view on television, not on YouTube, on television. So the reason I'm choosing 1992 or 1993 is because by that point, there weren't that many reruns anymore of Archie Bunker. So I'm trying to divide our society. Don't like that expression being attributed to my name, but in this statistical example, I'm trying to divide the society between people who could have seen Archie Bunker on TV with the people who not only could not have seen him on TV, don't even know who he is, okay? Who this fictional character, as it were, this television character, who he is, okay? I don't say who he was because he never existed. He was a character. That's why I'm saying who he is, okay? But it's possible that, around 50% of our society doesn't have a clue who that man was, okay? Could be higher, could be lower, not sure. But just in terms of the statistics, we're getting to the point where these cultural references no longer have meaning because people know who they are, because Americans don't know who that person was, don't know what that person stood for, even stood for according to some other group, and so to me, this is showing us that there is a frame of reference and what used to be a common understanding of how American life was lived with its problems, okay, which the court cases address elegantly, okay, and a significant portion of American society does not understand those references, doesn't understand what life was like back then, okay? I have a client where one of the issues he has to deal with, or dealt with, I guess I should put it that way, was being in a location in the United States where every weekend the Klan would show up because he was there with some other people who looked like me and hey son, And they would show up every weekend and do their protest or whatever the heck that's called. And it's just like, thankfully, there's a whole lot of America that cannot relate to that at all. Okay. But where it creates a problem is where that former understanding led to legislation, led to a perspective that a majority of judges had when they made a decision that is then lost, right? And so there can then be erosion also of certain protections. I'll put it that way. But that's it's a really interesting position to be in. The demographic issues actually make me optimistic in the sense that America, in terms of her spirit, has always been westward focused and forward looking. Okay, leaving behind these burdens from medieval Europe or wherever else somebody came from is part of how we work as a nation. And so we may be at the cusp and then going through a turning point where we then refocus our sights forward to what we're going to address, to what is coming, to whom we wish to be, which to me as a conservative means how we wish to behave, not what we wish to be because we showed up being something and it's immutable. So how we wish to behave, that we can, refocus our efforts on that, and hopefully that will bring, bring about some better court cases and address, certain issues that persist or what have you. So, yeah.
So I'm going to go back to the book. I'm going to pick up another little piece here because there's a lot that Dorollo said there, and there's a few pieces here that support what Dorollo's saying, and I want to throw those into the mix as well. And so from the National Constitution Center, speaking of demographics, these are two young men writing about the common interpretation of the 14th Amendment. I want to throw a little bit of this into the conversation because I think there's something there that Dorollo and Libby are both getting to that I think is relevant for leaders here. And so from the National Constitution Center, I'm going to quote from Brian T. Fitzpatrick and Theodore M. Shaw. I'm going to quote extensively from their writing here. And so kind of walk along with me a little bit here, and then we'll pull some of this from Fitzpatrick and Shaw into what Libby and Dorollo, the points that they are making here. We're going to pull these all together. And I'm gonna make a larger point and then ask a much larger question. Ratified as it was, so I quote directly, ratified as it was after the Civil War in 1868, there's little doubt what the Equal Protection Clause was intended to do: stop states from discriminating against blacks. But the text of the clause was worded very broadly, as Libby even pointed out, right? And it has come a long way from its original purpose, again, as Libby and Dorollo both have pointed out. For example, despite its reference to states, the clause has been read into the Fifth Amendment to prevent the federal government from discriminating as well. Near the end of the 19th century, the court considered whether racial segregation by the government violated the Constitution. Dorollo mentioned this as well. If people were separated into different facilities by race, but those facilities were reportedly equitably suitable, did that constitute discrimination? Historians have debated whether the 14th Amendment was intended to end such segregation, but in Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, the court ruled by a 7-to-1 vote that the so-called separate but equal facilities, in that case train cars, for blacks and whites did not violate the Equal Protection Clause. The decision cemented into place racist Jim Crow era laws. In a famous dissent, Justice John Marshall Harlan, who Dorollo brought up, disagreed, stating our Constitution is colorblind. Plessy remained the law of the land until 1954, when it was overruled in Brown versus Board of Education. The Supreme Court unanimously overruled the reasoning of Plessy and held that separate schools for blacks and whites violated the Equal Protection Clause. Brown was a decisive turning point in a decades-long struggle to dismantle governmentally imposed segregation, not only in schools, but throughout American society. Brown was a turning point, but it was not the end of the struggle. For example, it was not until 1967 in Loving v. Virginia that the Supreme Court held that laws prohibiting interracial marriages violated equal protection. Although the original purpose was to protect blacks from discrimination, the broad wording has led the Supreme Court to hold that all racial discrimination, including against whites, Hispanics, Asians, and Native Americans, is constitutionally suspect. These holdings have led to an ongoing debate for the last several decades over whether it is unconstitutional for governments to consider the race of blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans as a positive factor in university admissions, employment, and government contracting. We will address this question in our separate statements. The Supreme Court has also used the Equal Protection Clause to prohibit discrimination on other bases besides race. Most laws are assessed under so-called rational basis scrutiny. Here, any plausible and legitimate reason for the discrimination is sufficient to render it constitutional, but laws that rely on so-called suspect classifications, quote unquote, are assessed under heightened scrutiny. Here, the government must have important or compelling reasons to justify the discrimination, and the discrimination must be carefully tailored to serve those reasons. What types of classification are suspect? In light of the history of the Equal Protection Clause, it is no surprise that race and national origin are suspect classifications, but the court has also held that gender, immigration status, and wedlock status at birth qualify as suspect classifications. The court has rejected arguments that age and poverty should be elevated to suspect classifications. One of the greatest controversies regarding the Equal Protection Clause today is whether the court should find that sexual orientation is a suspect classification. In the recent same-sex marriage opinion, Obergefell versus Hodges, 2015, the court suggested that discrimination against gays and lesbians can violate the Equal Protection Clause, but the court did not decide what level of scrutiny should apply, leaving this question for another day. That is from the National Constitution Center. This was written back a couple of years ago. You can go online and get it, and we'll have links to that below the player in the show notes. Look, both of those scholars restate what Libby and Dorollo are saying here. They use different words and they frame it, they put it in different order, but they're basically restating what Libby and Dorollo are saying here. But they don't address the relevant point that Dorollo made, which is this one. Government putting its nose into places where government doesn't belong in an attempt to garner more power. And this goes directly to something that Dorollo said, when we begin to expand the nature of what is an immutable characteristic, what is a suspect classification, to include things that used to be outside the ken of government, for instance, who we marry or who we choose to have intimate relations with. And by the way, it is a choice. It may be a compelled choice, but it is a choice nonetheless. Look, when we expand government into those spaces, well, now Caesar is out of the box. We have a three-pronged checks and balances system where the Supreme Court can put the legislature back in the box, or the legislature can put the Supreme Court in the box, or the executive can be bound by both the legislative and the judicial branch. This becomes interesting, particularly for leaders, because what has happened over the course of many, many years is as those immutable characteristics have become, as thinking about those immutable characteristics has become less and less of a culturally shared thought process, i.e. Archie Bunker, and has become more and more of a process where individuals get to decide, as was stated in Obergefell v. Hodges, individuals have a right to decide what their own conception of reality should be. I think that was actually in the Supreme Court decision. We are demanding that government, that Caesar, honor more and more of those conceptions and legitimize those conceptions and find rights where there may never have been any before. This is a real problem. And I recall the words of Andrew Jackson when he allegedly defied the Supreme Court over Worcester v. Georgia back in 1832. the decision that moved Cherokee Indians from Florida to Oklahoma. And by the way, the 14th Amendment exclusively removes Indians from protection, and they were not granted such protections until the 1970s. That's something that's also interesting to point out. But I recall the words of Andrew Jackson: John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Who puts Jackson in the box? Who puts the Supreme Court in the box? Who puts the legislature in the box? And fundamentally, at the end of the day, with power, particularly, Dorollo used the term democratic society. I prefer a republic. In a republic, under a republican form of government, which is what we are still under, who controls Caesar? Who tells Caesar no? And so this is a turn, right? Because I think part of the turn of the tide that I think we are on, and I get the sense in the cultural zeitgeist something has shifted, and I'm talking about this a lot this month. Part of that turn is how we handle the civil magistrate. And on episode number 65 of the podcast, which you should go back and listen to, we talked about how the Bible addresses dealing with the civil magistrate, in particular the Old Testament, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles. But the Bible is almost inextricably linked to the Constitution. How do we put the civil magistrate back in the box? Who puts Caesar back in the box in our republic? How do we continue to bind Caesar? So I'm going to let Libby start on this because this is a big question, right? And I think it is a tide turning type of question. And by the way, Caesar is more than happy to infiltrate all parts of society and culture, more than happy to take power, but it's really hard to get that power away from Caesar and get it back. So how do we do more of that? How do we do more of keeping Caesar in the box, Libby?
First of all, I actually am quite optimistic about the future. I am a pragmatic optimist. Nothing is certain. I do believe that society overall globally moves up and to the right. That's a finance term, but I do believe that we move up and to the right. As I was reading the Declaration of Independence again, and the Constitution and the amendments, as well as the Federalist Papers, I was just so at awe and inspired by the brilliance of our founding fathers to anticipate the whims of human nature. And Dorollo spoke to this specifically. You have too, Hasan, but I see it in business all the time, is folks who do not want to give up power once they have it, and the expansion of power. So any organism, institution naturally wants to grow, and it's not necessarily malevolence that's driving it, but it is this natural desire to want to grow and expand. And there are only a few individuals or organizations who are willing to check that, to always have what are our goals and objectives, how do we measure when we've gotten there, and to check ourselves around, do we need to continue to grow and or relinquish some of the power in this market to someone else, and that could be public and private markets. That takes a very disciplined individual, and in our current society, and the SOS syndrome, shiny object syndrome, has never been more of a threat in this dopamine fueled world where people aren't feeling seen or valued, and so this narcissism and drive for being seen by the things that others say matter it could be a challenge. But our framers saw and understood the tendencies of human nature and the value of the balancing against federal versus state and the individual. The way that we constructed the Senate versus Congress. Senate is more deliberative and equal distribution across the 50 states, whereas the House is much more populist. Every 2 years, we get potentially have a whole new set of representatives, and they are more reflective of the current cultural norms or care-abouts. The judiciary is the check with the lifetime appointments, where they actually are the wizened old individuals who have lots of experience, can think through complexity and navigate laws and implications and more deliberatively. And then we have the constraint on the executive power. But the Republic was a beautiful form to actually allow for these ebbs and flows of human nature towards, totalitarianism to individualism, totalitarianism to individualism. And you can even see, the way that our republic was formed was brilliant, but you can even see just in human nature, the generational impulses, are almost force of self-correction, from one extreme, pendulum swing to the other, where each generation is by our nature, we're fighting the generation ahead of us, and we have to learn on our own what truth is and what works. But that natural tension between one generation and another actually is always putting in check and questioning where we're going and how we're getting there. The biggest challenge that we have is the pace of change right now, and how individuals can be using the pace of change to take on more power, potentially. Hence why we see this drive towards censorship and to shutting down anything that's inconvenient, because the organism wants to grow. It does, and it will not die. It will not be taken down. It will fight to its last living breath. But we have been through huge technological changes before, and we always come out moving up and to the right. So while I didn't expect these bumps in the road in my lifetime, I just thought I was going to get a lot smoother. We were course correcting a lot faster. It was unanticipated, but overall, I am optimistic, given the structure of our government, as well as the fight of the individuals and the balance we have between decentralized communication with centralized communication. There's a lot in there, but I'm optimistic.
Yeah. Dorollo, looking at it from a little bit of a different lens, what's your response to what Libby has had to say there? Are you pragmatically optimistic as well, or do you hesitate a little bit?
Yes, I'm also optimistic. I don't know how pragmatic I am as an optimist. I think I'm just more a visionary type optimist, where the details are vague, but I know it's going to get better. The pragmatism comes up certainly from a legal perspective, and the individual, and as a litigator, the individual court cases and what they will build. But with where society, will go, well, God knows that, where society could go, where American society could go. I'm definitely excited about certain options. It's definitely The pace of change is relentless. I don't think that's our biggest issue. I think one of our biggest issues is, and certainly the election of Donald J. Trump as president of the United States in 2016 demonstrate that there is a large amount of Americans who feel disenfranchised with how government functions. Arguably that number is growing, and they're not all on the political right. There are many on the left, and there have been for decades. It's just the media doesn't paint the picture that way. That's one of the reasons I made that comment. But anyway, there's this large amount of Americans who are disenfranchised with how government functions. And when you insert into that circumstance rising costs, uncoupled with rising compensation in a general sense that has any real meaning, okay? And what I mean by that is if somebody's salary, if a woman's salary has gone up on average, 3% a year over a decade, but the price of gas doubles in 1 year, it doesn't matter what happened over a decade. The pain point is on, the means of transportation to get to and from work, to and from the store, to and from life, okay? And that is significantly impacted by rising costs that are, where there's certain costs where the increase is obviously significantly more than any average. Anyway, what my concern is that, this is exposing a large amount of disenfranchised people who are just going broke and living from paycheck to paycheck. And one of the things that America stands for and has always stood for is opportunity. The notion from the beginning was, as it were, we get government out of the way, here's what we can do. And that's literally what happened in the English colonies. Okay, largely the government, meaning Parliament across the water, was out of the way. And so free people were able to show up and do life the way they wanted. And they built these amazing and different, diverse, actually, founding societies along the Eastern Seaboard. And we can contrast, and historians have, of course, contrast how that colonial experiment went differently from the Spanish colonial experiment in Florida, the French, si j'ai préféré en tant que quelqu'un qui parle français. So obviously I have a preference to the French way of trying certain things, not in this context, but I'm still going to reference it that way in French, of course. That's another competing experiment, okay, in colonial society and governance. And the Spanish, and actually probably more properly should say the Mexican experiment out west where I actually live, okay? These are competing experiments in how to basically found a society ex nihilo, okay? In the English version, opportunity was one of the things that was central to it. And so that's what attracted people the way it did because of that, and it grew because of that. Now, something else worth pointing out, the English way of doing things attracted Germans, attracted Dutch, attracted other Europeans to their experiment because it was different than and Swedes also, because there were Swedish colonies along the Eastern Seaboard in Delaware actually. But anyway, they stayed, as it were, and grew in part because the English experiment was centered on a notion of rights that allowed men to do certain things, okay? And the pursuit of opportunity, and certainly that means economic opportunity, was central to that experiment. It's great. Fast forward, though, a few hundred years, and here we are, where opportunity has become scarce in America. And whichever side, as it were, figures out how to fix that may end up enjoying the type of reign, R-E-I-G-N, over the Republic for a significant portion of the future. Because again, there's this large disenfranchised part of the American populace, and somebody's got to reach them. When I'm looking forward into the 21st century and the challenges that we face, the existential challenges we face as a nation, it's ironic to me that one of those is this internal issue of wither opportunity, and how do we persuade it to come back, and of course, fundamentally, as usual, there's at least two opinions, and they run counter to each other. And one of them is get government out of it, and the other one is government has to do more and spend more. And so it's just like, we already know that, right? We already know that's what's going to be positive. But real attention needs to be paid to that problem and trying to fix that problem. Because we have gone from, and I'm going to use it's not even an analogy, it's just using a circumstance that helps illustrate this. Okay, we went from, when I was in high school in the 1990s, where you could get a car with your part-time job working at a grocery store because it was affordable, because the insurance costs were affordable, because you're driving around doing your thing, doing your life. Great. You could then get an apartment. You didn't have to live with your folks. You could rent an apartment. And at that point, you probably had a full-time job, but you could rent an apartment and do life as an adult in America with these rights. Okay. And we have morphed from that to the society where the kid ain't leaving the basement. Okay. We went through, he can't leave the basement. We just went through that. Okay. We got out of, COVID, thankfully. We went through that. The kid can't leave the basement. We went through that. Oh, we can't afford to buy a home. We can't afford to buy a starter home. We can still rent, but okay, fine. Guess you'd rather live in the basement, fine. But we went through that to now the kid ain't leaving the basement. We don't know what the heck is going on, but he's stuck in the basement. And I mean, there are cynical parents who would say, as soon as you turn the internet off, that kid is gone. Okay. When that kid has his own phone plan, that kid is, meaning he's no longer on yours. That kid is gone. This will help, help cure the failures to launch, right? When he's cut off from certain parental resources or largesse or indulgence or whatever you want to call it. But when I contrast how it was in the 90s to now, though, what gets my attention is not, hey, why is this kid unmotivated or whatever? But it's like, wait, well, what opportunities are there for you? I know there will be opportunities for that kid who's sitting in the basement with a bachelor's degree that isn't in dance, okay? A bachelor's of arts in dance, he may not find a job. If he has a bachelor of arts in something functional or something that is old, he'll be okay, okay? There'll be things that he can do. I'm not worried about him. I'm worried about the majority where they don't have a bachelor's degree. Fine. So what are they going to do? And why is it hard to be cobbled together one or two employments and then fund a life that can include a spouse and children? It's got to be fixed. I'm not an American who wants to see what we do abroad shrink in terms of certain types of aid that we give, okay? But eventually, the voices saying you need to turn that aid domestically, eventually that's going to start to have some moral weight, okay? Because a system that is, regardless of what you call it, a democracy or a republic or what have you, but a system that is set up to permit an elite to farm resources off of whoever's domestic and then ship that abroad, eventually somebody starts to notice that kind of directional vector and say, wait a minute, why are you guys there? What are you doing with our, in quotation marks, our resources, close quote. And when they can fund their lives and do whatever, they're not asking those questions. They're asking those questions because they're saying, hey, here's what I can't get. My folks could get it. Why can't I? I make more nominally per hour than them, but I'm still behind every month. Meanwhile, you're pumping billions to someplace I can't find on the map. And you may say, okay, it's justifiable because of XYZ factors, but I don't agree with that. So we need to change something. Like, we need to get way the heck ahead of that whole conversation and figure out, okay, as a society, where are we going? What are we doing? And ironically or not, this amendment helps make that possible. It means we're all in the same boat. It means that we're all supposed to be protected the same way. And so, the changing demographics, the character of the society, none of that matters. Like, the structure is in place. And to go back to a question you asked slightly earlier, who put Caesar back in the box? Well, thankfully here, you don't have one Caesar, you have three, okay? And it's the other two put Caesar back in the box, and then they turn on each other and then do the same thing. And then Caesar comes out of the box, put the other one back in the box. And that whole kind of triangulation, that's how it's supposed to work. And Madison waxed eloquently about that in the Federalist Papers, and very wisely. And I think, with just a hat tip to Montesquieu, Charles de Secondat, Baron de Montesquieu, with a, hat tip to him. Hey, the reason the British system worked is because you have these competing sovereigns, as it were. The reason this great republic works is because the branches can check each other. So President Jackson can say, this aberration, this abomination called the Bank of the United States, I'm not renewing that. And all of a sudden, the sound currency, the sound hard currency, and the need to work to get capital helped fund the next 30 years into the Civil War, right? Because he was unwilling to let that corruption scheme, because that's what it was, continue. It'd be interesting to see him around today for several reasons, but one of them is, how would he look at Chairman Powell? What would President Jackson do when he said, wait, you did what to the what? To the interest rates? You did what? Here's a nice contrast. Until you have to back up 2 weeks because they just made a change last week. But if you look at Russia's central bank, they did a better job tackling inflation during a war that they're fighting with my wife's birth country, Ukraine. If you look at the Russian central bank and what they've done, it's fascinating because central banker is a woman who had inflation in check until about last week. And so it's pretty fascinating because, I wonder, that's how I got onto this rabbit trail, but I wonder, how would, President Jackson look at that? And then, but the short answer, that in my mouth is the long drawn out answer, is that, use the other Caesars to put Caesar back in a box. And thankfully we have them.
I think Dorollo is onto something and Libby is onto something here. But I think even more importantly, there's a third factor that politicians who are more politician than statesmen miss. And I think the culture misses it because it doesn't know how to articulate it, because we're so far away from that common small c Christian core now. And it's this doctrine of optimism. We need a doctrine of optimism in order to make this next thing work. So Libby may be a pragmatic optimist. Dorollo may just be optimistic. But I am a person who believes in a doctrine of optimism, much like, and Dorollo mentioned this, much like Madison. So let's take a turn here for a moment. Let's look at the Federalist Papers. We're going to read pieces of Federalist Paper number 39, the conformity of the plan to Republican principles. Because remember, I said it's a republic, right? And I quote from the Federalist Papers, backing up both Dorollo and Libby here, from our friend James Madison. The last paper, having concluded the observations which were meant to induce a candid survey of the plan of government reported by the convention, we now proceed to the execution of that part of our undertaking. The first question that offers itself is whether the general form and aspect of the government be strictly Republican. It is evident that no other form would be reconcilable with the genius of the people of America, with the fundamental principles of the revolution, or with that honorable determination which animates every votary of freedom to rest all our political experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-government. If the plan of the convention, therefore, be found to depart from the Republican character, its advocates must abandon it as no longer defensible. What then are the distinctive characters of the Republican form? Were an answer to this question to be sought not by recurring to principles, but in the application of the term by political writers to the constitutions of different states, no satisfactory one would ever be found. Holland, in which no particle of the supreme authority is derived from the people, has passed almost universally under the denomination of a republic. The same title has been bestowed on Venice, where absolute power over the great body of people is exercised in the most absolute manner by a small body of hereditary nobles. Poland, which is a mixture of aristocracy and of monarchy in their worst forms, has been dignified with the same appellation. The government of England, which has one Republican branch only, combined with the hereditary aristocracy and monarchy, has with equal impropriety been frequently placed on the list of republics. These examples, which are nearly as dissimilar to each other as to a genuine republic, show the extreme inaccuracy with which the term has been used in political disquisitions. Love that word. If we resort for a criterion to the different principles on which different forms of government are established, we may define a republic to be, or at least may bestow that name on, a government which derives all its powers directly or indirectly from the great body of the people, and is administered by persons holding their offices during pleasure for a limited period or during good behavior. It is essential to such a government that it be derived from the great body of society, not from an inconsiderable proportion or favored class of it. Otherwise, a handful of tyrannical nobles, exercising their oppressions by a delegation of their powers, might aspire to the rank of republicans and claim for their government the honorable title of republic. It is sufficient for such a government that the persons administering it be appointed either directly or indirectly by the people, and that they hold their appointments by either the tenures just specified. Otherwise, every government in the United States, as well as every other popular government that has been or can be well organized or well executed, would be degraded from the Republican character. And then I'm going to move ahead a little bit. He's going to talk about constitutions. Could any further proof be required of the Republican complexion of the system? The most decisive one might be found in its absolute prohibition of titles of nobility, both under the federal and the state governments, and in its express guarantee of the Republican form to each of the latter. But it was not sufficient, say adversaries of the proposed Constitution, for the convention to adhere to the Republican form. They ought with equal care to have preserved the federal form, which regards the Union as a confederacy of sovereign states, instead of which they have framed a national government, which regards the Union as a consolidation of the states. And it is asked by what authority this bold and radical innovation was undertaken. The handle, which has been made of this objection, requires that it should be examined with some precision. Without inquiring into the accuracy of the distinction on which the objection is founded, it will be necessary to a just estimate of its force, first, to ascertain the real character of the government in question, secondly, to inquire how far the convention were authorized to propose such a government, and thirdly, how far the duty they owed to their country could supply any defect of regular authority. Close quote. The character of the republic comes from its people. This is what Madison knew. And by the way, so did Hamilton, and so did John Jay. The character of the republic comes from its people, but the character of the people, well, the character needs a doctrine, it needs a container, it needs a worldview to operate in. And when that worldview no longer is animated by a Christian spirit, by a religious spirit that is expressly Protestant, what will animate it? What doctrine are we going to fall under? I fundamentally believe that nation states as well as individuals need a vision of the future that is optimistic. Dorollo talked about being a visionary. We need an optimistic vision. Individuals have to adopt an eschatology of the future that sees problems, but this is the but, engages with enough cultural confidence to overcome them. And Dorollo talked about the disenfranchised person who can't afford to get a used car while they're working at McDonald's. Yeah. And our cultural confidence in the United States typically comes from solving large problems like the Revolutionary War or the Civil War or even World War II. And we tend at a nation state level to grind out horribly when looking to solve incremental problems like taxation or abortion or racial-based conflicts or any of the current contre-Trump over what bathroom we'd like to go to. Leaders think about, they develop and they promulgate to their followers a doctrine of optimism, and they do so even in the face of apocalyptic possibilities and potentials. And so, Libby, I think this is the core question as we sort of round the corner here on this podcast episode today on this panel discussion. I think this is the core question. If we want to keep the republic, we won't be able to appeal to Republican principles. That's too far back. And it won't be an appeal to Christianity, whether it comes with a capital C or a small c, at least not yet. The leader who will win will be pragmatic in solving the McDonald's part-time job car problem. But if you pragmatically solve that without a doctrine of optimism, it doesn't matter. So, Libby, how do leaders, and Dorollo, I want you to think about this question too. How do leaders construct and express a doctrine of optimism? Because it's been at least 40 years since Ronald Reagan said it was morning in America. And I don't think people believe that anymore.
This is really exciting and challenging. One, you do need a vision of optimism. People want to create, people want to move towards something, and it's more sustainable when you're actually building. Destruction, may feel good in a moment, but it's not sustained, and it's also not great for the soul. We want to move towards positivity, and what good leaders do, they don't deny reality as it is, and they come up with solutions that they know will address the root causes of reality as it is. And so, one of the reasons why Reagan was so compelling was because he was honest about some of the challenges. I can't forget there's nothing more permanent than a short-term government program. We're dealing with the noise and cacophony of overregulation. That is actually one of the reasons why companies don't pay anymore. All the layering of costs, to operate a business, and or many other factors. Why we can't, why the pay for a frontline employee can't pay for rent or a new home is because all the cost. It's not profitable for companies to build new homes that are affordable anymore because of the layering of regulations on top of each other that make it so expensive to actually build a basic home. And so good leaders actually can look at the full system and identify holistically the sets of issues and challenges that we have, be realistic about what the root causes are of those challenges, not that it makes me feel good in the moment root cause. That really isn't the root cause. In business, we talk about the 5 whys. 5 whys will get you to what the root cause of a challenge may be. But you need to look holistically at the set of issues, what the root causes are, and then paint a picture of how you're going to address that in a meaningful way. And many leaders forget how smart society is and individuals are. And they can sniff out when you're not being authentic, when you're not actually addressing a real root cause of an issue. This is one of the reasons why, like when I hear Vivek Ramaswamy speak, or I hear our RFK Jr. speak, their truth is our truth. We see the insanity, and our current leaders aren't willing to speak truth because they're inconvenient to their continuation of having power and what they've promised to others. So that Reagan was optimistic. He always had a smile on his face. He could laugh at situations. We need leaders who embrace the challenges from a place of true inspiration and not condemnation of others, that give you hope. And so, when I think about it from a leadership perspective, one of the biggest challenges that we have, and we have many, but one of the reasons in this free money world that we have so many people that are just chasing growth, hoping that they can exit and become rich and then move on and live life like they'd want. In this world where only growth and its revenue and profit is valued, we've eroded value in everything. So what we used to wear, our clothes would last forever, and now in this world of recurring revenue, even in clothes, we've got a recurring revenue model because our clothes fall apart in less than a year, so you have to buy something else. And all of this, growing the revenue and maximizing profitability, we've eroded every experience and product and service out there. We need to be thinking about how do we focus on value creation, but just value in general. Stop this the pursuit of profit at any cost. Think about I'll think about it from a business perspective, and we can apply it to a government and service perspective. But you care as much about your customer experience, not just monetizing your customer so you can grow your revenue. But what is that customer experience and problem that you're solving for meaningfully? Not your business problem, which is how to make money, but your customer's problem. How do you help your partners to be successful? How do you help your employees to be successful? And and if you're playing a good long game, your investors will be successful. But right now, everything is about money, and we've lost sight of what true success looks like and feels like, and things that may be getting in our way of being successful. Some of those things that may actually be getting in our way of affordability of quality products, being able to pay employees what employees deserve, in return for their effort. But RFK Jr. is appealing to folks because he's actually talking about middle class solutions. Vivek is actually talking about, and RFK is also talking about how to break apart the regulation capture. So you've got to actually break apart some of those organizations to build them again so that they're actually meeting their objectives. But when we actually think about what will turn the tide and why you optimistic and a positive, why we need that positive vision is because that's, it's a positive vision spoken on truth and showing people how to get to that world that we all want, where we all feel valued, where we can pursue the goods, services, lifestyles that are right for us. And I know I get so passionate that sometimes I lose my train of thought, but It's about this balancing of the system and looking at things holistically and systematically, speaking truth to what about root causes are, and not just puffery around what I'm going to promise you, and never, and being able to say you promised it because there was no meat on the bone. True leaders are very specific about how we will get there. They're true leaders that are inspiring and optimistic, give you hope in the future and show you how you can actually participate and help us move towards the future. It's not about destruction, it's about reconfiguring and creating.
Fortunately, I think we're at the end of deconstruction. I think, well, I think, I think here's what we do collectively as Americans, and I'll let Dorollo answer this question. Here's what we collectively do as Americans. We argue viciously for about 10, 15, maybe even 20 years max, right? Knockdown, dragouts. I mean, real brutal. Sometimes people get canceled. Sometimes people get shoved to the side, reputations get destroyed and then are rebuilt. And then someone somewhere, and it's not on social media, it's not even Archie Bunker, it's not in Hollywood, it's not in the, it doesn't show up in the pages of the New York Times or in the Los Angeles Times. No one in any of the major cities kind of could spot it. But here's what we all collectively do. We all collectively call time. And we call time because we're done arguing. Someone calls time. And then we all, 51% of us, sort of drift and pull the other 49 in a particular direction. I think time has been called. But I get that sense. And maybe that's part of my optimism. Maybe I'm just crazy delusional, right? Maybe we're still in the fight mode. But I get the sense, particularly with a couple of the Supreme Court decisions, and I didn't revisit the one on the website issue and the cake designer, but there's a real challenge there with free association, freedom of worship, and freedom of speech. And I think a move is being made. I think a shift is. I think someone's called time. Basically, someone's called time, and it's going to take a while. But the other 49%, whether they want to or not, are going to drift along. But it would be better if we had a leader with a doctrine of optimism. So Dorollo, how does a leader cobble together a doctrine of optimism in this country where 80% of people are just not paying attention to politics? Even in a post-COVID environment where like all that 80%, got all scared witless by what happened.
So optimism is a belief, right? It's a belief. Or perhaps it's based on a belief. Optimism is a perspective on one's present circumstances, and it's a view towards the future, and it's based on a belief. The perennial example, of course, is the glass of a substance that is 50% full. And so your perspective that it's half empty is based on a certain belief. And somebody else's perspective that it's half full is based on another belief, right? But that for leaders, and that's how everybody functions. For leaders, it's important to then translate that belief into a vision, okay? A vision for how life can be. And then it's important to say it, to embody it, and to live it. And as Libby pointed out very well, you would see President Reagan smile. He would laugh at things, okay? He embodied the vision he had declared. And so that it doesn't matter what industry or field a leader is in, that needs to be done. Then you have to live it. And that living includes, having to make tough choices. I think Libby evoked very well the need to return to a value creation that is separated from revenue generation. Now, here's the great irony. Every single human being you will encounter once existed within an organization in which value creation is entirely separated from revenue generation, or people are committing grave crimes. And what I'm, of course, referring to is a family. Okay, family is about value creation separated from revenue generation. Families, of course, are those little socialist platoons that allow us to get values, generate values, apart from the quid pro quo that is necessary for the larger, what I'm going to call adult capitalist world. Okay. And so that's something that has to be returned to. Now, we haven't evoked community or Wendell Berry yet. Okay. That man and his wife fascinate me. And he has this great body of work. And among he has this great body of written work. At the same time, he and his wife farm full time and have been for longer than I've been alive. It's amazing. Okay. Anyway, this man turned his back on academia and he didn't return to the woods. He walked through the woods back to the family farm and proceeded to both farm and write at the same time, and has done so for decades and decades and decades. Anyway, one of the things that is basically a constant reference in his great body of work is this idea of community. And he means something that is not an amorphous society with no face. He also means something that is not the state. And he talks about the community, and he talks about rights within the framework of community and duties and responsibilities within a community. The reason I evoke community right now is because that value creation that happens in the family, those little socialist platoons, the way they connect with other platoons is in community. And of course, you can't do that through a screen. Eventually, you got to meet in person. And of course, you know, back in the age of, definitely dating myself. So a decade and a half ago, back in the age of, you know, internet dating and stuff like that, like, well, eventually you got to meet. That's where the life actually happens, right? Right. And so that needs to be re-evoked for the current generation in terms of both, you know, community building, social activities, things like that, where it's like, hey, you got to get off the screens. Screens are great. Even somebody who's analog says the screens are great. Eventually, you got to get off the screens. So, you know, you've got the leader's optimism comes out of his or her belief structure, but it has to be translated into a vision, and then you've got to say it, you've got to embody it, and then you've got to live it. And I've actually, I almost forgot, the fourth step is one that is more likely to be neglected, I think, than any step other than actually declaring the vision. That's probably the main thing that doesn't happen. But one of the most critical pieces that isn't done, and I think, again, it's the second most not done step, is you have to pass it on. You're not going to be here forever, not in these bodies, thank God. So eventually you've got to pass it on. And so part of the crisis that our institutions are going through is that leaders haven't figured out, hey, you're not going to be here forever. So you need to raise up other leaders and then empower, train them, discipline them. Then you're going to empower them, and then you're going to go away. You're going to go somewhere else and do something else. You're going to go golf. You're going to go do whatever you're going to do and enjoy your life. And if you can't do that, that should immediately cause you to call into question what the heck you're doing. Why can't you let it go? Why can't you let it go? Why does it mean so much that you can't let it go? Why can't you afford to let it go? Oh, okay. Well, there's some issues you got to address there. But so you've envisioned it. You got to say it, you got to embody it, you got to live it, and then you got to pass it on. You know, but I think this is exciting work. And of course, this is work that anyone with a family is engaged in. You know, I'm not one of these who is bemoaning, you know, oh, we're going to bring children into the world and it's this bad. And it's like, I'm Black. This is a lot better than Alabama in 1955, than Mississippi in 1840. Stop. Like, please. I don't care if we started getting into real exchanges with Russia. Do you want to be Black in Alabama in 1955? Maybe. But do you want to be Black in Mississippi in 1840? Get out of here. No, you don't. No, you don't. So Yes, living now. And I mean, that's an easy analysis. Here's another easy analysis. How about whitening toothpastes and some of these cancer treatments that are amazing, and the rest of this? I have a friend, his cancer treatment is based on stuff in his genetics where the treatment is doing things with it's unbelievable. And he, in part, is alive right now because of that. And so it's like, really? But you don't want to bring, and that's just, the perspective of like self-preservation. What about the problem-solving paradigm? What problems are they going to be able to fix? That's super, like, that stuff excites me. It's great. And yeah, and I also look forward to, this great republic being forced back onto its rails, because, we're kind of on the side scraping the rails instead of the wheels on the track moving forward. And just so you know, I'm not worried about the McDonald's example with the kid can't get a car. It's a kid who can't get a car is working at McDonald's. If I have an adult working at McDonald's who doesn't move into management after a certain amount of time, that to me raises a question. Because what I want to do is see whole industries where I'm going to put you over here, and then you're doing this essential role, and you're never going to be in management, but you're going to do this essential role, and you're going to be well remunerated and cared for, and you're going to keep showing up and doing this, and we're all going to be able to benefit from this product that you're helping to generate. I want to see the return to that. I want to see the return to lines of men and women outside saying, you can hire me, I'm ready to do the work. Because when the compensation is right, all of a sudden we see these anomalies, okay? Like when the shale gas and oil boom hit the Dakotas, and they were paying teachers almost $100,000. Because anytime, just so y'all know, anytime thousands and thousands of men show up in one physical place and they stay there for about 5 to 7 years, all of a sudden you need new schools to be built and stuff like that, because all of a sudden there's all these kids, right? So they were paying teachers, they were advertising for teacher jobs in the middle of nowhere in the upper Great Plains. It's just like, so that shows me, hey, the nation still has certain things in the nation still work. Next point. The motivation apparently was there, and it was latent. And then this economic circumstance, this arbitrage, as it were, called it out. And all of a sudden, boom, people show up and they're ready to go. Okay, great. So how can we more effectively channel that so we start evoking it in ways that then can grow and build capacity, and then build a model that we can then use to persuade at least some other sections of our country, hey, you should try it this way, like easy examples, like, oh, how do Florida and Texas with all those people make it work with no state income tax? Oh, wow, what a question. What a question. How does that change things? Well, one of the books that I'm slowly making my way through is called Why Nations Fail. Mm-hmm. And Achimolu and Robinson, I think they're onto something. Now, I disagree with one of their fundamental premises, but of course I'm going to, because I'm me and I'm conservative and a capitalist, but whatever. I still love the analysis. I think they did a great job of bringing together a lot of information and perspective on why certain nations seem to take off and others just don't. Really, really, really fascinating. But, part of what they, in my view, correctly identify in terms of how nations can turn a crisis into an existential opportunity to reform, refashion, relaunch oneself is it's called transformational institutional reform. And that's what we need. Now, my fundamental belief, my spiritual belief about why Donald J. Trump was actually elected president in 2016 was because it was going to be a judgment on every single institution in American society. And that's literally what you see. It doesn't matter what it is, Little League to who knows what. Everything got judged just because he got in that office and did whatever he did. Okay. And so I don't think we're done. And not just because he's still running. We're not done. Our institutions still need shaking, and they still need to be brought to a point where the leaders of those institutions are forced to recognize, yeah, we need some kind of transformational reform because this just ain't working. And so for me, having left the southern tier of New York for, the Sun Belt, where right now it is probably some seemingly hellish temperature outside, 111. Yep, that's Fahrenheit. Yeehaw. All the highs this week are in triple digits, and most of them are in triple digits above 110. I left a region where that region grew and thrived because there were employers there who offered a life in exchange for economic activity, and it worked. And then something got broken, and it's still broken. Okay, that's one of the reasons we left. It's still broken, but we can address those issues. And one of the things that is exciting as a citizen and not exciting as someone who does political things is that either party can grab a hold of this and just run with it, because people ain't really political when you show up and say, hi, here's what I'm going to pay you, here's what you're going to do. I'm going to train you so you can do the job. You don't have to worry about it. And then this is what I need. Okay, what's the catch? Where's the trick? Is this one of these hidden video things? Like, where's Nick Cannon or somebody else? Like, am I being fooled? And it's like, no, you're not being punked. You're not being fooled. That's how America used to work. Pun intended, is how America used to work. And it just amazes me. With only a slight hint of bitterness, it amazes me to ponder on how many of these problems wouldn't exist if America worked the way America used to work.
I'm going to turn the corner on this a little bit. I want to thank Dorollo, Nixon Jr., and Libby Unger for coming on the podcast. This is the first time we've ever run a panel discussion, and I wasn't quite sure how it was going to go. I think we had good back and forth. We laid out some good ideas here. We laid out some tracks, and I want to close, or my final thought, my closing argument, I guess, is this. Following up on something that Dorollo said, but also reverberating back to things that Libby has been saying throughout our entire conversation. What makes America work, quote unquote, what makes the republic work are deep beliefs, right? Beliefs that come from worldviews. And our worldview does matter. How we chase a worldview, how we look at a worldview. And we'll be examining some of this on the podcast next month when we talk about books like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. There's worldview issues that are inside of those books, and we'll be addressing that on some upcoming shorts episodes. But leaders have to have a worldview. Case in point, there's an apocryphal story of a certain Mrs. Powell of Philadelphia during the Constitutional Convention, and she allegedly asked Benjamin Franklin, upon seeing him exit the Constitutional Convention in that broiling summer of 1787. By the way, back then when they had full wool on and it was 85 degrees in Philadelphia and they all thought they were going to die, not 111, and it's dry heat, by the way. It's also 111 in Texas, where I'm at. It's a dry heat, though. It's fine. But it wasn't a dry heat then. In Philadelphia, it was humid and there was no air conditioning, right? At least not yet. And Mrs. Powell asked Benjamin Franklin, well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy? And he infamously replied, Dr. Benjamin Franklin did, a republic, if you can keep it. This is the thing, right? 236 years later, if you can keep it really does matter. Have we financialized everything out to the furthest corners of the edges of sanity? Yes, we have. Have we deconstructed everything down even to the individual building blocks of reality itself? Yes, as a culture, we absolutely have. Have we codified and codified people's behavior at an individual level and searched for new rights inside of our founding documents and inside of our common law and inside of our shared language? Yes, yes, we have. We've also built things to dizzying heights. We've created drugs that can cure cancer based on genetics, or at least treat it infinitely better than just blasting it with radiation. We have sent a man to the moon, and we are continuing to push that even further, despite what the conspiracy theorists may have you believe, and kept all of these things. And we have arrived at these places going through both the lowest of the lows, like the Great Depression and the Civil War, and the highest of the highs, like VE Day or VJ Day. We are at a moment of a third turning. I fundamentally believe this, or if you want to go global, a fourth turning, but I like to keep it to the United States of America. I think in the United States of America, folks like Libby and Dorollo and myself, we are laying the bedrocks. We are laying the foundations of a revolutionary generation that will be coming ahead of us. We aren't the generation that writes the words of the next founding. I don't believe that. I don't think we'll live that long. But we are the generation that lays the concrete so that those next words can be written. We're at a turning point. And this podcast, while not in and of itself a cultural podcast, we are a podcast that focuses on the nature of leadership and how that nature intersects with the reality of living in the Western world. And the reality of living in the Western world is that we are at a new founding, not one based on abrogating the divine right of kings, or one based on the ascension of the individual to a state of equality with the monarch. Instead, this third founding is beginning to develop based on a foundation of individual leadership. Leading, and Dorollo's talked about the little pockets of little socialist tribes called a family. Yeah, leading to a reintegration, a return to family and community, but looking in a different kind of way, looking like something else. Leaders need a vision of the future. Leaders need a doctrine of optimism. They also need clear strategy and explicit tactics to get there. But leaders need to keep their finger on the pulse of the cultural zeitgeist. They need to be paying attention to the Supreme Court decisions and reading the Constitution and rereading the Declaration of Independence and reminding themselves that when the tide turns, you want to be ahead of the turn, not in the slack water. And for sure, you don't want to be caught in the ebb of the tide. That's how leaders nowadays, at the beginning of this third turning that I'm very optimistic about, will stay on the path. Libby and Dorollo, I'd like to go to you for your last words. How can leaders stay on the path at this, I think, critical moment in the nation state of America? Let's start with Libby.
I think it's the reiteration of the threads that we've pulled throughout. And I really liked what Dorollo had said about the fact that, we've moved into the weeds, off the rough, in the fairway. It's about refocusing on, really the things, the real big things that matter. Painting a holistic vision, with clear objectives around what we're trying to accomplish and how move away from these one-offs, absolute solutions to small to targeted problems, and look holistically at the entire system and how we can address some of the real root causes to challenges in society. That it's painting a very positive vision for the future. Being, as Dorollo said and you said, it's about embodying that too. Your mindset around the glass is half full versus the glass is half empty. We do have about 50% of the country one who likes to tell others what to do, who views who views the world and the glass is half empty. And there's another 50% that views the world pragmatically and optimistically around who we can be and who we are as humans, wanting to participate in the bettering of society on the whole, believing in our fellow man being human. But I really do believe that if we cater to our best nature, focus on our best nature, paint a positive vision of the future, and embody that enthusiastically while walking our talk, that we can move the needle and move ourselves up and to the right.
Thank you, Libby. Dorollo, how can leaders stay on the path? Closing words on today's podcast episode.
Excellent. So, yes, it definitely comes out of the leader's core set of values, right? It should be a part of the vision, but one of the motivators can be the fact that if you don't do it, it ain't going to happen. And so, well, you better get to doing it. And there's certain advantages to that, including things like, oh, you may actually end up having less of a risk of dementia because you're still trying to make it happen and you're 80, 90, whatever. But remember, I still said you got to pass it on. So like, to me, there's a role for council and tribal elder type persons functioning in that role. And it's not the same as, the CEO. But anyway, I digress. That's a little rabbit trail as usual. If you don't get it done, it ain't going to happen. So get up and get it done, and just keep plugging away at it. Structure your plan so that you can achieve little victories, because that can help not just keep the motivation going, that can reinforce the motivation. I think leaders need to make sure that they're taking time doing life in its other aspects, okay? Because burnout can happen when you're spending too much time at work, when you're spending too much time, in the saddle, as it were. You're going to run into problems. Yeah, it's just, it ain't going to get done unless you do it. And, another perspective on it for me is I look back and see all these awesome things that, in my view, God has accomplished through the American nation. It's like, oh, I don't really want this to end. I want this to keep going. Like, dude, there's so many people we've been able to help and to bless, and to do it in a way where, we used to be known for our humility. We weren't always the, sneaker wearing, shorts all jacked up, show up in a foreign country yelling tourist type. That wasn't always us. It used to be like, oh, thank God it's the Americans, because it could have been this nation or this nation over here or that nation over there, and then it's like, oh, wait, we don't want them. We'll take the Americans, thanks. And that, without, well, let's make a reference to it. It was still like that, even with certain persistent problems. So, ironically or not, one of the one of the English court cases that helped enshrine civil rights in terms of access to hotels, etc., for persons regardless of race, came about because of American discrimination against other Americans in England during a war, of all times. And then somebody saying, oh, let's try this. And English courts being like, you can't do that crap here. No. Which I think is great, And so, meaning the fact that they swiftly shut down that nonsense. That's what I mean in terms of that. That's the part that was great. But yeah, it's just, there's still so much that needs to be done. There's still, very many people who need to be empowered to be able to not just live their lives, make the world a better place. And I don't really see, certainly on scale, I don't see that happening in other places the way it happens here. I just don't. And so, I feel privileged in that sense to be one of us. And it's just like, all right, so let's use this, like this doesn't exist for no reason. Let's use this. And one of the weird things about leadership, of course, in a democratic nation are notions that, one has a right or responsibility to then step up and do this. And it's fascinating because in other systems, that's already taken care of. It's like, oh, you're the son of whom? Okay, you're good. No one's going to challenge your right to show up and start declaiming and doing stuff. And in our, as Libby was talking about, in our system where it's based on competition, that's how you get to Harvard competition. It's like, oh, okay, great. Let's do that. Hold on a sec. Well, actually, let me end my comments there.
And with that, I'd like to thank both Libby and Dorollo for coming on the podcast. That knock was the sound of Dorollo getting the hook, and now I'm getting the hook. So I'd like to thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And with that, we're out. Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. If you're listening to this on any of the major podcast players like iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, please go ahead and leave us a 5-star review and write a little bit in there. A couple of sentences is good enough. That actually helps us game those algorithms that I was just maybe addressing. And, of course, it helps us grow the show. Tell all your family, tell all your friends, and tell the leaders in your life that you know that need to be listening to this show that this show exists. By the way, if you want to get started on the leadership path yourself, or you know some people who need to go on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing, the home company of Leadership Toolbox and Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, can help you and your team do that. So check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We are remote, we're live, we're in person, we're on video, and we've got leadership development solutions for your civic group, nonprofit staff, public sector staff, or even your private sector leaders. And of course, you're going to want to check out our video-based subscription service at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com for leadership development on demand. You don't like videos, you don't like training, but you really like the podcast? Well, I would also recommend reading a book. Matter of fact, I'd recommend reading my most recent book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. You can get that in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Ingram Spark, and any other place that you order books online. Finally, of course, we're on YouTube just like everybody else is. We'd love to have you help us grow the YouTube channel, so like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing, or you can search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button. Subscribing helps us grow the show, as it does with the audio, just is the same with the video. All right, that's it for me.